So good evening or good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for joining us for this Chicago Book Salon organized by the University of Chicago Center in Paris in partnership with the Éditions Amsterdam, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics and Culture at the University of Chicago, and the France Chicago Center. It's a real pleasure to be here today for discussing Magali Bessone's and Matthieu Renault's excellent book, W.E.B. Du Bois, Double Conscience et Conditions Raciales, published by the Éditions Amsterdam. I will be moderating the discussion between our four panelists. The way we will proceed today is that Magali Bessone and Matthieu Renault will present their book for about 20 minutes. This presentation will be followed by a discussion with Jennifer Pitts first, and then with Louis Gordon. Please feel free to use the Q&A option on your screen to submit questions at any time. We will take some audience questions after the discussion. Let me now briefly introduce our four panelists. So Magali Bessone is professor of political philosophy at the Université de Paris, Panthéon-Sorbonne. She is a member of the Institut des Sciences Juridiques et Philosophiques de la Sorbonne. And this year, she is fellow member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Her research focuses on contemporary theories of justice, critical race theory, and reparation for colonial injustices. She's the author of Sans distinction de race, published by Vrin in 2013, Faire justice de l'irréparable, also published by Vrin in 2019, and she translated in French and edited W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, published by La Découverte in 2007. Matthieu Renault is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Paris 8 Vincennes-Saint Denis, and is a member of the Laboratory of Studies and Research on Contemporary Logic of Philosophy. His research focuses on the relations between philosophy and non-European societies, the post-imperial history of knowledge formation, and their reappropriations from minority standpoints. He has authored Frantz Fanon de l'anticolonialisme à la critique postcoloniale, published by the Éditions Amsterdam, L'Amérique de John Locke, l'expansion coloniale de la philosophie européenne, also published by the Éditions Amsterdam, and he also wrote a book on C.L.R. James, La vie révolutionnaire d'un Platon noir, published by La Découverte in 2016. Jennifer Pitts is professor of political science and the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. She is an expert on modern political and international thought, empire, the history of international law, and global justice. At the University of Chicago, she's a member of the faculty boards for the Human Rights Program and the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. She is the co-editor with Adam Getachew of W.E.B. Du Bois' International Thought, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press, a collection of 24 of Du Bois' essays and speeches on international themes from 1900 to 1956. Her previous books include Boundaries of the International, Law and Empire, published by Harvard, and A Turn to Empire, The Rise of Imperial Liberalism in Britain and France, published by Princeton. Louis Gordon is professor and head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut at Storrs. He's also honorary professor in the Unit for the Humanities at Rhodes University, South Africa. He works in the areas of Africana philosophy, existentialism, phenomenology, social and political theory, post-colonial thought, theories of race and racism, philosophy of education, and philosophy of religion. He has written particularly extensively on Africana and Black existentialism, post-colonial phenomenology, race and racism, and on the works and thought of W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon. His two most recent books are Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, published by Routledge in 2021, and Fear of Black Consciousness, published by Penguin Books this year in 2022. So I would like to thank the four panelists for being with us today for this Chicago Book Salon. And so the floor is yours, Magali and Matthieu, for the presentation of your book.
Thank you very much. So I'll start the conversation and Matthieu will follow. So first I want to thank you, Arnaud, for organizing this Chicago Book Salon, and also Jennifer Pitts and Louis Gordon for their generosity in discussing our small book. So to introduce the conversation, I would just like to say a few words, very shortly, I hope, about the context of the conception and writing of the book and its specific transatlantic situation. And Matthieu will dig into the specificities of the content of the book. So the idea of W.E.B. Du Bois' double conscience and condition raciale, racial condition, came from Matthieu. He knew that Éditions Amsterdam were creating a new collection centered around one concept and one author. And he reached out to me to propose that we write together about Du Bois's notion of double consciousness. So I want to thank him here for this brilliant suggestion. I'm very grateful that he asked me to be part of this adventure. First, because, and I'll come back to it, writing about Du Bois in the Francophone and French context seems to me a very important and timely thing to do, both from a theoretical point of view and from a political point of view. And second, because the whole writing process with Matthieu has been extremely pleasant and scientifically very rich. And, you know, writing together can be a risky bet. Voices can be discordant, viewpoints can be opposite, even contradictory, which could have been the case since, as you will see, Matthieu and I didn't come to Du Bois through the same intellectual paths at all. But the experience has been nothing else than both enjoyable and rewarding. So I first met Du Bois's writings more than 20 years ago when I was living in Boston at the time. I was writing my PhD dissertation in philosophy. And I was focusing, or the dissertation focused on norms of institutional and personal visibility. That is, principles of publicity and transparency in the United States from the founding fathers on, so from the end of the 18th century till throughout the whole 19th century. And I was figuring visibilities or norms of visibility as grounding political and ethical principles of the liberal Republican nascent ideology. And we were at the turn of the 21st century. So it was also the time in France when the racial and colonial question was gaining momentum in the public sphere. The debate about the so-called ethnic statistics was raging at the end of the 90s. The Taubira law, which recognized that slave trade and slavery were crimes against humanity, was enacted in 2001. And these are only examples of something that was really present in the public sphere. The racial question was also becoming less of a taboo among academics. And for me, it was a time when I realized that it may even become or be, for French people, a valid object for philosophical research. Somebody in Boston at the time mentioned to me that I should read W.E.B. Du Bois's Source of Black Folk, a book in which I could find resources both for my interest in the modalities of visibility and invisibility of political subjects in the public sphere, and for my interest in the critical theory of race. So I did, and I was mesmerized. I found out that there had been a French translation of The Souls of Black Folk published in '53 for the 50th anniversary of the original edition in English by the editing company Présence Africaine. But the translation was long out of print, And when I read it in the French National Library, I realized that it was not a scientific edition. There was no paratext. There were no footnotes, no introduction, no foreword, etc. So the absence of contextualization made the reception of the text in France somewhat difficult. Moreover, some of the translation choices seemed to me at least outdated. And for instance, Negro was translated as nègre, which by 2001 had become, in my opinion, inaudible. So I thought the time had come for a new translation, because France was in the need of Du Bois's thought, and the formidable figure that he was virtually unknown in France, at least in the academic sphere, and a little less so in the activist sphere, particularly among the new generation of activists that came to the fore in the early 2000s and renewed the landscape of anti-racist and decolonialist movements. So the translation was published actually in 2004 by les presses de l'Édition de la Rue d'Ulm, then afterwards bought by La Découverte. And my guess is that this translation is the reason why Matthieu reached out to me to co-write this book with him 15 years later. During these 15 years, only 2 other articles had been translated into French, Du Bois's articles. The Conservation of Races by Stéphane Dufoy in 2006 and The Talented Tenth by Ouria Bentouami in 2013. So for over 10 years, Du Bois remained confidential in the academia, and a very small portion of his work was accessible to a general French audience. Things have changed very recently. An exhibition called The Color Line, African American Artists and Segregation, in direct reference to Du Bois's phrase, the color line, was organized in 2016 in the Musée du Quai Branly and featured some of Du Bois's infographics, both tables and drawings, about African American lives in Georgia. And then some of his work was translated, work in history, the last chapter of Black Reconstruction, the translation of which Matthieu was part of, he will tell you a little more about it, was translated in 2018. The Philadelphia Negro, so his sociological main work, was translated in 2019, and his main autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, was translated in 2020. I think a novel is expected, The Quest of a Silver Fleece. We'll talk about it. So all of a sudden, many of the aspects of this towering scholar are being publicly recognized in France and made available in the French context. I'm not sure exactly why this is happening, besides a very global hypothesis. First, for various domestic and geopolitical reasons, France has recently entered into a period of end of amnesia, to put it this way, in regard with its colonial and slave past, which explains also the moral panic of its conservative intellectuals, media figures, and politicians, who fear that this sudden recognition may threaten the myth of a triumphant colorblind republicanism. In this perspective, Du Bois's work can speak to a French audience because his analyses were never only about African Americans and their exceptional socio-racial situation, but always at the same time situating the US within a transnational or international imperial and colonial perspective. His analysis reached out from the start to the diagnosis of a global color line, to use an important phrase. And I was reading one of his articles from 25, which really, I think, pushes towards this interpretation. So there are epistemic resources in Du Bois's thought that are of high interest for a diagnosis of France's own racial issues. Or at least this is the conviction that lies behind this book, and we try to remedy the lack of French engagement with Du Bois's thought. We conceived the book as an introduction to the conversation, accessible to anyone who is interested in gaining knowledge, not about the man, but about his thought. And I want to specify here that we're not historians. Both Matthieu and I are philosophers. Although we both believe that political concepts and arguments need to be understood in their situated context of enunciation, that political concepts are historically and socially situated, and that a correct understanding of their meaning has to proceed from an inquiry into their usages and the potential disagreements they may fuel. So this is what we attempted to do for the concept of double consciousness, which we chose for two reasons. One, through the analysis of the use and meanings of the concept of double consciousness in Du Bois' work, it seemed to us that we could reach and present several important dimensions of his thought. First, we could give him insights to the concepts of color line, which is the focus of chapter 1, veil of color, which is the focus of chapter 2, and second sight, which is the focus of chapter 4. We could also situate Du Bois at the confluence of several intellectual influences, Hegelianism, transcendentalism, pragmatism, among others. And we could insist on the complexity and dynamics of Du Bois's own interpretation of the Black subjective experience, as well as of the situation of Blacks as knowers, that is, subjects and not merely objects of knowledge. Second reason, while the term itself only appears once, so technically it appears twice, because the original article was republished in Souls, but it only appears, so let's say twice, in Du Bois's 35 volumes of edited work. It has been very influential in the reception of his thought and in the production of standpoint epistemologies, both in Africana philosophy and in feminist studies. And we wanted to explore some of the reasons for its success and its success as an epistemic resource for understanding our social world. So we wrote the book in a pedagogical perspective and in the hope that many other books written by people coming from different disciplines, history, sociology, comparative literature, political science, etc., will follow, and that Du Bois will become one of the mainstream references in an increasingly decolonized library or curriculum. And I leave the rest to Matthieu.
Thank you very much, Magali, and I renew the thanks to Jennifer, Louis, and Arnaud for organizing and accepting to participate to this discussion. I will talk about the book by coming back to my engagement with Du Bois writing, which started when I was a master student preparing a thesis on Frantz Fanon. I read an article titled The Construction of Racism and published in 2005 by Etienne Balibar, who in a footnote wrote the following quote: Fanon's theorization, which is still waiting for a great philosophical commentary, draws on both the Hegelian phenomenology of master and slave as read by Kojève, Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex, and the psychosociology of double consciousness in W.E.B. Du Bois' work as reinterpreted from the perspective of a psychoanalytic splitting of the ego, end quote. In many respects, though quite unconsciously, the research I conducted for my PhD on Fanon was nothing but an attempt to put such a hypothesis to the test and explore its many ramifications. Fanon's works with and against Hegel was apparent, even if the mediation of Beauvoir's gendered rewriting of the master-slave dialectic was somehow hidden, and I was able to excavate it only a few years later. But as for Du Bois' double consciousness, the fact is that there was no explicit trace of it in Fanon's writing. So I asked Balibar about it, and he answered to me, you know, my hypothesis was purely heuristic, and very heuristic it indeed proved to be. I discovered a bit later that such an idea of a presumed filiation was certainly induced by the cross-reading of Fanon and Du Bois that was already common in the US. Reading through scholarship on Du Bois in English, especially Shamun Zamir's Dark Voices, I realized that what Balibar presented as the two roots of Fanon's thought were actually intertwined, insofar as by way of Josiah Royce and other white American Hegelians, Du Bois had himself reworked and displaced Hegel's notion of an happy consciousness from the point of view of Black consciousness. This source and others of Du Bois' double consciousness are briefly dealt with in the shortened interlude of our book. The intellectual route that leads from Du Bois to Fanon still need to be traced back, but I'm pretty sure that it cannot be recovered with the classical methods of a history of ID, insofar as it is part of a much wider network engendered by the underground circulation of the psychological and political trope of racialized consciousness as a divided consciousness. As a conclusion on this point, if our reading of Du Bois sometimes sounds very and maybe too much Fanonian, especially in chapter 2 on the veil of color, I'm responsible for it. In more ways than once, my own research past did not allow me to do otherwise. The second stage of my dialogue with Du Bois' writings also occurred during my PhD, when I learned about the notion of potentiated double consciousness as it had been conceptualized by Paget Henry, Lewis Gordon, and Jane Gordon, on the basis of Du Bois' assumption in the souls of Black folk that, quote, the Negro is a sort of seven sons, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world. This assumption found its full meaning more than a decade later in The Souls of White Folk, an essay which showed that double consciousness was not only a sign of alienation, a curse, but also, and potentially, a blessing to the extent that it provided African Americans with the ability to know their enemies from the inside, so to speak, and thus to dissect the logics of whiteness that rule global politics as imperialism. In other words, it gave them an advantage in terms of knowledge that could be turned into a crucial instrument of emancipation. This idea or schema of epistemic and political reversal was pivotal in my interpretation of Fanon, and it combined quite naturally with the post-colonial approach that prompted my examination of the boomerang effect generated by his displacement of European thought. Later on, and that's something we deal with briefly in our conclusion, I began to figure out that Du Bois' potentiated double consciousness should be conceived as a founding moment in the making of standpoint epistemologies that culminated in feminist theory and whose roots have often, though quite conflictually, been traced back to Marx and again Hegel's so-called master-slave dialectic. For all these reasons, it seems to us crucial to devote a chapter of our book, chapter 4, to the powers of double consciousness by paying a special attention to the souls of white folk, but also to both the European scientific and pseudo-scientific sources and the popular or folkloric sources, especially Caribbean and African American, of the notion of second sight as what gives one the ability to see what ordinary people cannot see. We couldn't dig as deep as we wanted to on this topic, but this investigation would certainly deserve to be expanded. In our book, Du Bois' approach in Black Reconstruction is rewriting of the history of the Civil War and its aftermath from the Black slave perspective is examined as a prime example of a critical use of second sight in the fields of knowledge production. This use is somehow synthesized in the closing chapter, The Propaganda of History, of Du Bois' books, which scrutinizes the pernicious effects of whiteness as pervading American historiography. My interest in Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, and it's the third stage of my engagement with his work, was favored by my contribution as a postdoctoral fellow to the research project Writing History from the Margins, led by French scholars in the so-called American civilization, Hélène Lenontet-Lowry, Claire Parfait, and Marie-Jeanne Rossignol, and which included as a central component the edition of an anthology in French of Black historians from William Coopernell to Charles Harris Wesley. My interest in Du Bois' historical writing at this period was also elicited by the research I was leading for a monography on another great Caribbean intellectual and revolutionary, namely C.L.R. James, who, in his later years, insisted on the close political and methodological affinities between the Black Jacobins and Black Reconstructions, whose author he praised for being, quote, always driven by the need of expanding and making clear to Black people in what way they were involved in world history, unquote. Like it or not, for both Du Bois and James, deracializing or decolonizing history did not mean abandoning the idea of world history in favor of the alleged existence of multiple and irreducible conflicting historical narratives. It didn't mean deconstructing the master narrative of modernity, but rather reconstructing it from a minority standpoint. It didn't mean dismissing the claim of historical writing to be a truth discourse in the singular, but achieving its promises of justice and emancipation, which were perverted or repressed by white hegemony. I quote Black Reconstruction. The object of writing the history of the Reconstruction is simply to establish the truth on which right in the future may be built. We shall never have a science of history until we have in our colleges men who regard the truth as more important than the defense of the white race, unquote. These issues were partly outside the focus of our book, but I deal with them in an article titled The Courage of Truth or Deracializing Knowledge with W.E.B. Du Bois that was published in a special issue of the journal Raison Politique, to which Magali also contributed with a piece on epistemic justice in Du Bois, and that was coordinated by Nicolas Martin-Breteau, who, among other efforts to make Du Bois' thought better known in France, recently achieved a translation of the Philadelphia Negro. Magali talked about it. And finally, the last stage of my encounter with Du Bois' work. While studying the sources of the notion of double consciousness, I went further than I was able to do during my PhD in the exploration of Du Bois' appropriation and transformation of William James' psychology of plural consciousnesses, which, as he would say later in Dusk of Dawn, quote, had predated the Freudian era, but had prepared him for it. Now, this research was closely related to another one, which was then in its inception, on the fruits of the intersection between two displacements. On the one hand, the travel of psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts from Middle Europe to North America, and on the other hand, the great migration of African Americans from the rural south to the industrial north during the same period. In other words, the research on the birth of Black psychoanalysis in the 40s and 50s, with a focus on its most pivotal figure, Richard Wright. This investigation that I presented a couple of weeks ago in the research seminar, Race and Culture, Philosophical Questionings, co-organized by Magali, incidentally showed that Wright, through his notion of the African-American outsider's double vision, as he says, was a crucial link in the adventure of double consciousness, and more specifically in the history of its travel across the Atlantic from the US to France. But Wright's exile in Paris and his dealings with existential phenomenology also shows that the movement was from the outset both ways, as one can identify in Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty, and others, the seeds of standpoint epistemologies. So, contrary to what is assumed by the French despisers of gender studies, decolonial theories, race, or as it's said now, wokeism, as a virus coming from the US and threatening French universalism, the notion of situated knowledge, and not only deconstruction, is also a French invention. In conclusion, the fundamental transnational making of minority epistemology from Du Bois onward is perhaps the better evidence that they are anything but relativistic. Thank you.
Shall I go ahead, Arnaud? Okay, Thank you. Thank you so much to Arnaud for organizing this and bringing us together, and to Magali and Matthieu for their excellent book, and to everybody in the audience for joining us. Thanks also to everyone for conducting this conversation in English. Appreciate that. On the subject of language, I want to say there was a new word that I learned in reading the book, which is États-Unien, which doesn't have a cognate in English, and it's a very useful word because when we use the word American to refer to the United States, it's tremendously irritating to residents of the rest of the Americas. So I want to say that although I'll be using the adjective American to describe the United States, I want to take it as read that I mean États-Unis. So I appreciate the word. So I want to start by saying that I think the book succeeds wonderfully on two quite different levels. First, it's a focused and scholarly analysis of the concept of double consciousness, as Magali and Matthieu have both discussed, especially in relation to Du Bois's best known book, Souls of Black Folk, but not only, and it has wonderful kind of brief excursions into some important other essays. So that's one level on which it succeeds, but it also succeeds as an introduction to Du Bois's thought for general readers. And so I thought I would start my comments by saying a couple of the reasons that I think it's so valuable as an introduction to Du Bois's thought. So although I take it that the book by no means sets out to treat Du Bois's thought as a whole, it succeeds in broaching a number of commitments and preoccupations that were lifelong preoccupations of Du Bois's over the course of his extraordinarily long and complex career. They also convey the erudition and richness of his cultural and intellectual references, his versatility as a writer of many different genres, and his value as a theoretical resource for us today. So I want to just spend a little time on each of those contributions that I think the book manages. So first, even though the book is primarily about Souls of Black Folk, which fell relatively early in Du Bois's long career, Magali and Matthieu use the theme of double consciousness as a route into some of Du Bois's most significant preoccupations. They're wonderfully effective at drawing out a set of themes that became essential features of Du Bois's thought, even though not all of these themes are as obviously central to Souls as they would become to his thought more generally. And I'll say more about this in a moment, but these include, I think, prominently the global nature of the color line and the global context for white supremacy in the United States. And relatedly, the centrality of Africa to world history and of members of the African diaspora, African Americans and others as agents of world historical developments. That's a theme that becomes very prominent, for instance, in Black Reconstruction, but it's there in earlier essays as well. And it's there kind of in Nuche in Souls in ways that I think the book wonderfully brings out. So that's the first thought, that it's just a way into really important preoccupations, lifelong preoccupations of Du Bois. Secondly, a key feature of Du Bois's writing is his omnivorous intellectual and cultural engagement. His writings are filled with allusions, often implicit allusions, in the way of an educated man of his time, to literature, to philosophy, to cutting-edge social scientific developments of his day, to historical events that are now fairly obscure. This erudition is part of the pleasure of reading him, but for contemporary readers, it's also easy to miss a lot of what is going on in his texts because the dense web of allusions is only partly visible to us. And I take it that this is partly what Magali was referring to in saying that a translation of Souls without an apparatus makes it hard to grasp a lot of what's going on. And in this regard, I think the brief interlude on the sources of double consciousness that Matthieu mentioned does wonderful double duty. So it's a short chapter, as he said, but it's not only illuminating about the circulation of the idea of double consciousness in literature and in academic psychology in the years leading up to the publication of Souls. So substantively, it's really valuable, but it also serves more generally as an example, I think, of the rewards of doing this kind of contextual work for our understanding of Du Bois. So it's a rich excursion into the context of double consciousness in the work of writers including Emerson, William James, Alfred Binet, the novelist Pauline Hopkins. And it's it's an excursion that's grounded in both the text of Souls, picking up on threads that are laid in the text itself, and also in Du Bois's biography, for instance, in his studies at Harvard with James and Royce and others. And in this interlude, they show how Du Bois took up and resignified the idea of multiple personalities or multiple consciousnesses, which was being explored by James and others as not only a kind of lack or disability, but also a potential source of insight beyond so-called normal consciousness. They do this all very effectively in a matter of just a few pages. And then by connecting double consciousness to an earlier source in the unhappy consciousness of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and arguing that Du Bois decontextualizes and recontextualizes that Hegelian unhappy consciousness, they also open up the connections and resonances between Du Bois's use of the Hegelian idea and Hegel's own thought, and also, again, as Matthieu has said, a series of other lines of thought that developed in conversation with Hegel's ideas, including Fanon and Simone de Beauvoir. And one of the things that I found really fascinating in the book was precisely this line of argument about the way in which the encounter between, or the multiple encounters between Fanon and Beauvoir and Richard Wright served as a means of transmission of Du Bois's thought into French existentialism and French anti-colonial thought. And while knowledge of this kind of intellectual context, the kind of deep dive into Pauline Hopkins's novels, for instance, isn't essential for understanding what Du Bois is doing with double consciousness, I think it helps us to see something else about how Du Bois's text works, and that is the layering of different levels of argument and different levels of cultural illusion, and the way it the way Du Bois pulls in his readers and encourages his readers to explore more deeply paths that he indicates and lays out. So I think it was part of Du Bois's authorial strategy to draw readers in with allusions and references that can be followed up to deepen and enrich one's experience of the text. Maybe the most obvious example of this is the bars of music that Du Bois places at the head of each chapter in Souls, which are musical quotations of African-American spirituals without words, without titles, and which will strike readers differently depending on their level of cultural knowledge of something like this work. Some people may not be able to make much of these bars of music, but may be able to take it as an opportunity to engage in research. And I think Du Bois does that quite a lot in wonderful ways throughout the text, and double consciousness is one example of this. And this interlude that Matthieu described is I think, a wonderful example of what happens when you pursue these trails of breadcrumbs that Du Bois leaves for his readers. So that was the second point. The third is that they managed to convey something of Du Bois's extraordinary versatility as a writer. So he wrote as a historian, a pioneer of the new discipline of sociology, as a novelist, as a master of the essay form. And for readers who are not familiar or just getting to know Du Bois as a writer, this feature of his production, I think, is a really important aspect of who he was as a writer. And so the fact that the book is able to get at this feature of his writing by way of the characters that you discuss in chapter 3, I think is quite valuable. So chapter 3 discusses the historical figures of Booker T. Washington and Alexander Crummell, and then two figures who were people intimate to Du Bois, Josie, one of his students in rural Tennessee, and then his son, Burghardt, whose death of diphtheria at the age of 18 months is the subject of I think the most moving chapter of Souls, and also a powerful discussion in your book, and then the fictional character of John Jones. So just to pose a question briefly here, one thing that I think the book discusses less, and to me one of the most striking and powerful features of Du Bois's writing, is his authorial voice, the kind of I of Souls and of his other writings. Often explicitly autobiographical, but not always. His I appears even when he's not writing in an explicitly autobiographical vein. And I thought maybe it would be worth discussing more what you make of this I. In a way, he's a kind of rival to Booker T. Washington. He's a kind of heir to Alexander Crummell. He's very present in the chapter on his son. And there may be more to say about what you make of that I in relation to the theme of double consciousness. And then fourth, as again, both of you said, the book helps, I think, to explain what makes Du Bois such a powerful theoretical resource for us today for understanding racism and white supremacy, both in their psychological workings and psychological effects, and in the way they structure the modern world, the way they intersect with capitalism, the way they distort and disrupt democratic politics. And so as an introduction to Du Bois, the book is valuable in giving us a sense of how much he has to offer us for thinking today. On this point, as a brief aside, a kind of local University of Chicago point, just today, the University of Chicago made the official and quite exciting announcement of the founding of a new department of race, diaspora, and indigeneity. And I think this is an initiative that can be understood precisely as working in the vein that Du Bois pioneered, that in contrast to other ways of thinking about studying race, this department is organized around the idea that the modern world was largely defined by imperial expansion, by regimes of forced labor, by global patterns of trade and migration, that processes of racialization were central to these phenomena, and so that the study of race, diaspora, and indigeneity is essential to kind of social scientific and humanistic understanding of the modern world. So that's also a brief announcement to the world about this wonderful new department. I should wind up fairly soon. I want to move on to a couple of substantive themes, and most centrally the argument, which I think is key to the book, that Du Bois understood the color line as a global phenomenon, and that from the beginning and not only later, he was concerned with the global context for racism and race in the United States. And if I were sharing slides, I don't know if I can share slides, but I thought it might be worth, I think I won't attempt that. Maybe at the end of the conversation I can do that. I have a slide of the first image in the Paris Exposition Universelle map. Should I do that? Okay, I'll do it later. But in any case, this is an image that Du Bois produced in 1900. It's at the bottom of the image, it says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And it's very clear from his earliest articulations of that thought that he meant it entirely in a global context. So the global dimensions of Du Bois's thought are vividly apparent in his essays in many of his books, including Dark Water, which comes up a few times in your book. But the global context is less apparent in his two best known books, Souls of Black Folk and Black Reconstruction. And so while it's been the subject of a lot of outstanding scholarship and is well known to close readers of Du Bois, it may be less well known to those who are coming to him through those two books and through Souls in particular. So I think that your book's insistence on the global color line as the starting point for understanding Souls is particularly valuable. Why is this so important? There are a few reasons, I think. For Du Bois, white supremacy in the Jim Crow United States, which is the subject of Souls, was a particular manifestation of a global phenomenon, the complex of slavery, capitalism, and imperial exploitation, and the ideology of racialization that developed and spread to justify these forms of exploitation. Both the distinctiveness of the form that white supremacy took in the US and the fact that it was part of a global story were important to Du Bois for reasons of analysis, that is for understanding how and why it functioned, how it arose and why it functioned. The fact that what was going on in the US was part of a larger global story. And it was also important for political action in the sense that it occasioned opportunities for political solidarity among members of what Du Bois referred to as the darker nations of the world, forms of kind of what today we could call South-South political solidarity. So for both analysis and political action, the fact that white supremacy in the US is part of a global phenomenon was, I think, essential to Du Bois. So from the perspective of analysis and scientific understanding, he placed the color line at the heart of the development of capitalism, industrialization, and democracy. He placed the slave trade and slavery at the origins of capitalism. And he argued that democracy in Europe and the US was parasitic on racial exploitation. And he called this the paradox of democratic despotism. So the idea that democracy is inseparable from racialized exploitation is a key thought of his. as he argued, from the time of the late 19th century, it was no longer the elites or the aristocratic classes that were exploiting the world. It was, as he said, a new democratic nation composed of united capital and labor. So democracy in the modern world was born out of and deeply entangled with slavery and imperialism in ways that he dedicated his life to studying. He articulated this argument most fully and pointedly in a series of essays around the time of the First World War, including, I think, the one that Magali, I think were you referring to Worlds of Color of 1925, which is a really key essay in this kind of chain of essays. So he developed the argument most fully about a decade after Souls was published, but the idea was present in his earliest articulations of the idea of the color line. It's present in his 1896 dissertation on the suppression of the slave trade, which is another piece that you discuss in the book. And from the perspective of political action, a number of points follow from the global nature of the color line. As I've said, strategies of political solidarity that were so central to his career, from the organization of the Pan-African Congresses to his novel Dark Princess, in which he dramatized and theorized a global revolutionary movement, to his lifelong efforts to connect with anti-colonial movements in Africa as well as beyond Africa, particularly in India. To insist on that, the global nature of the color line is not to deny that the color line in white supremacy took a distinctively direct and intimate form in the US. And as I've said, Souls is and Black Reconstruction. Souls is a study of white supremacy in the Jim Crow United States, Black Reconstruction of the self-emancipation of African Americans during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the dismantling of Reconstruction. And as you, I think, convincingly convey in the book, he believed that this fact gave African Americans a particular insight into the operation of white supremacy and a particular political role in the global struggle against it. But he also analyzed the color line beyond the United States and understood the color line within the United States as part of this larger phenomenon. There's more to say about double consciousness as an epistemic power. I thought that was a wonderful aspect of the book. I'm conscious of running out of time, so I think I'll skip that, but just say that the idea of Du Bois as a kind of insider outsider, somebody who, by virtue of being an American and being situated and educated within America, but also what he called, being a hereditary outcast at home, gave a particular insight into the workings of the US, which preoccupied him, throughout his life into the 40s and 50s when he was working in the global peace movement, and was reaching out to members of the peace movement outside the US, trying to explain and understand, explain to them something of US history that he felt his position as an insider-outsider gave him particular insight into. And then finally, in the discussion, I'd love to invite you to expand on the argument that you make about the implications of Du Bois's analysis for contemporary France. Again, Magali, you started to talk about this. There's a really powerful line, I think on almost the last page of the book, I think, where you talk about the majority's privilege of seeing without being seen, with respect to the politics of the Muslim veil in France, and the way in which the majority claims a privilege of seeing without being seen, as a kind of double game for which they condemn the racialized minority, but also play themselves. That seemed to me a profoundly insightful application of Du Boisian analysis to contemporary France, and I'd love to hear further thoughts about that. I think with that, again, I have further thoughts, but with that, I'll stop and hand it over to Lewis Gordon.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, so Hotep, Shalom, Assalamu alaikum. En France, bonsoir tout le monde, j'espère que vous allez bien. and to everyone else and everyone all around. I hope you're all doing well. So first, felicitations, congratulations, mazel tov, dua neter to Magali and Matthieu for writing this wonderful book. For those curious about dua neter, what does that mean? It's from the ancient East African language of Medu Neter. It's much older than Hebrew and a lot of the others. And it basically means both blessings and also congratulations. Okay. So I'd like to thank you first for presenting this meditation in Du Bois, and also to the organizers, Arnaud et al., for us speaking today, because today is the Du Bois's 154th birthday. And what better way to celebrate an intellectual than to talk about his thought? Now, I mentioned thought, and Matthieu hinted at this earlier, for a variety of reasons. We already know that there's a tendency when it comes to looking at Black intellectuals. There was a tendency before with the category women intellectuals, but if you say women intellectuals, many people presume specifically white women intellectuals, and the category of thought has emerged. So if we say women of color intellectuals, the same problem emerges. And that is, there's a tendency to prioritize experience over thought. And this has been a problem that has persisted all the way through to some recent writings on intellectuals such as Du Bois and Fanon, and others such as Audre Lorde. But the problem of experience and thought, and as Matthieu related that story, it persists in many ways because it is incorrect that there weren't detailed philosophical examinations of Fanon's thought prior to 2005. And in fact, in my book, Fanon, The Crisis of European Man, but also in Existentia Africana, I opened up with this problematic because there's a tendency to look at theorizing Black thinkers as an application of white thinkers' thought to those Black thinkers. And that relegates the Black thinkers to the realm of experience and the intellectualizing of that experience to the white world. Of course, there is a reason why groups who are either marginalized or dominated tend to appeal to experience, because part of oppression is the erasure of the idea of an inner life and a life of thought. But that is a trap, because simply put, everyone has the experience of trying to figure out their experience. And often, when you try to figure out your experience, you seek counsel from others. However, if the others are exclusively those who built their thought on their experience, then there's the surreptitious reinvocation of the European and European-descended experience as the legitimate site of experience. So in effect, the prioritizing of experience in the world of color undermines, ironically, the legitimacy of that experience. There needs then to be a liberation of thought. And the fact that Magali and Matthieu focus on the thought makes this text not complicit with the ongoing diminution of ideas from the world of the global South and the worlds of those who are dark. Now, the connection of double consciousness that Matthieu brought up to Fanon's analysis also comes, I would encourage those in the audience to consider, by way of Richard Wright. And Richard Wright is someone whom Fanon cited in his writings. And the crucial essay from Richard Wright, because Fanon was aware not only of Native Son, but also Richard Wright's autobiographical essays. But the essay in particular is How Bigger Was Born. And if you read that essay, you could see the presence of double consciousness at work. However, Fanon did not need to have Richard Wright or Du Bois to articulate in phenomenological terms the concept, but nevertheless, he was in conversation across the diaspora about it. Now, one little point as well is that although we think of Du Bois today in terms of the Atlanta School of Sociology, we should remember he did far more than that. He, after all, formed much of what is known today as, I put it in scare quotes, as Jennifer correctly pointed out, American sociology, and its export, both of them are actually from Du Bois. Because remember, at the time Du Bois was writing, what dominated sociology in North America and a good portion of the Anglo world was Spencerian, Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism approach to sociology. And the fact is that you can today go to many bookstores and find a book by Du Bois addressing sociological issues and social scientific issues and much more. That's a sign of the prescience and the connection of Du Bois's thought to the zeitgeist and beyond. Additionally, Du Bois, like many Black writers, I would include in this list Anna Julia Cooper, Antonia Fermat in Haiti, all the way through to Fanon and Denard and the Césaires, both Suzanne and Amy, that their writing is not disciplinarily decadent. I won't spell out the details of what I mean by that because I write a lot on disciplinary decadence, but the short version is disciplinary decadence is a reductive form of thinking that tries to squeeze reality into the discipline rather than to adjust the discipline to the demands of reality. And precisely because the methodological frameworks and the modes of writing developed under Euro-modern colonialism linked to the civil servants' offices and government manuals affected the modes of expression in the academy, these are among the epistemological colonial practices that these writers had to break in order to bring forth something that was being repressed, suppressed, or dissociated in those forms of thought. And that, as anyone could learn from reading Du Bois, Fanon, and others, but also this book, is simply put, their humanity. Now, Magali and Matthieu refer to the political consciousness of African Americans, and that is crucial because under liberalism and in neoliberalism, and in fact, there's a form of script in how to talk about dehumanization, especially racial dehumanization, and that script requires the moralizing of the discourse. But the problem with the moralizing and the individualizing of the discourse is that it conceals the dynamics of power through which that discourse is patently political. Thus, they're putting on the table that this is an analysis of a political consciousness, raises the question that Black consciousness is also politically constructed, that it's not naturally, you're not born with a Black consciousness, as an example, or a double consciousness, but it is formed, right, from within. Its form is double. Now, one thing I have to say is I actually disagree with the view of the subsequent translators of the Souls of Black Folk in France by writing out Nègre. And that is because, as Fanon has shown, and I argue in my book, Faire, Black Consciousness, Nègre and noir are not identical. They're not the same thing. And the failure to address the nuance could lead to distortions of interpretation. For instance, okay, Du Bois he's writing in English and he says the word Negro. But the history of that word is actually not in English. It is from Portuguese and Spanish to refer to the color black. But it's interesting that since both in French and in English, there are French words for black, like la noir, right? Referring to the color. And in English, black. Then the question is raised then, why did France choose a transformation of the Portuguese and the Spanish word? Okay? And they did that to create or to build a special racialized language in order to differentiate, in other words, to make it function as a mark of difference. In other words, it was there precisely to place the enslaved populations outside of the realm of the human. And thus, a unique French word, le nègre, was born. And there are historical conflicts when we think about this invention, because the Scottish effort, as an example, because a lot of the people in direct contact with the enslaved were Irish and Scottish, their pronunciation of the French term, again, they could use English, but they needed to use the French term in order to create the greater distance. And that's what led to the pejorative, excuse me, I apologize for using it, term nigger, which was actually the Scottish pronunciation of the French le nègre. So the question then, if we come back to it, is if we think about the English, Negro, it was anglicized in the plural to Negroes. And thus we already see a movement of differencing or differentiating through which the construction that people designating such are realized if you're born into a world that you're designated as such, as an imposition. To put it simply, one is not born a Negro, that is imposed upon one or a people. Now, Magali and Matthieu explored a wider 19th century resources of doubledness. So it wasn't that Du Bois didn't invent doubleness, but he invented in his reflections a specific way of bringing it into a conversation that addressed the times and, unfortunately, the times to come. One can look into Emersonian transcendentalism, Jamesian psychology, including his work on religious experience of the doubling of the self, and especially in experiences of failure. And of course, these are nuances that the authors were able to bring to the French language. I mean, through the French language with échec, because there are little nuances of failure that are not in the English language. And this is a wonderful way in which analyzing concepts from one language into another can generate nuance of theory, okay? Because you could say, for instance, raté, for instance, like raté de pair as an example, to be measuring up. And one can also talk about the kinds of failure in the sense that one can never actually become within that framework under the designation Negro, the category human. But as the authors, Magali and Matthieu, rightly point out, and this is on page 70, while William James is dealing with personal doubling, Du Bois is about social and historical alienation, about objective, lived, and material conditions of splitting. In other words, the doubling is not simply a question of a personal experience. It is actually an imposed reality. Du Bois thus anticipates Fanon's arguments of sociogenesis. But Magali and Matthieu also explore phenomenological resources such as Hegelianism. Though we should bear in mind Hegel's philosophy of history is a movement from east to west in the north at the occlusion of the dark south. So there's a logic in Hegelian explorations of consciousness that are also limiting, but Du Bois was aware of this. Magali and Matthieu, in raising the question of phenomenology of Black consciousness and double consciousness, are making an important and rigorous, I would add, move, because the terrain of phenomenology is, after all, consciousness. Thus, that Du Bois was in conversation with Jamesian, Persian, and Hegelian, Santayana, and others, and eventually Marxian discussions of consciousness, make this analysis clearly valid. But we should bear in mind that the originality, Du Bois's originality, was already at work in his discussion of spirituals, and in today's parlance, the creolization of languages of African America, the blues, and he was fluent in German, as those who study his life know, because of his study, for instance, for the doctorate in economics in Berlin. And given that fusion, I cannot imagine that Du Bois wasn't thinking through the complexity of the German concept Geist, through which he used the closest, though flawed, English formulation, spirit. So a lot of people, if you look throughout Du Bois's writing, he returns often to spirit. And it's this is one of the limitations of doing social theory in English. And it leads to forms of atomistic ways of dealing with communication and social reality, because Geist, as an example, but it's not just Geist, there are in other languages, similar concepts that are often occluded in the discourse, but Du Bois worked with what he had. Now, if we go to the analysis of the color line, this is an important one since it also poses arguments to consider regarding the anti-dialectics of colonialism and racism. And you notice I say anti-dialectics. And this is because, sadly, Du Bois was not only right that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, but it is like the ending of the movie Carrie, a hand reaching from the grave into the 21st century, precisely because in the 21st century, there are people afraid of entering the 21st century properly. In other words, there are people wedded to the conception of theory as formulated in the 20th, 19th, 18th, and 17th century that is including the addressing of 21st century problems. And among them, the effort to drag us into that closure is why we see the ongoing problems of the color line. But I say anti-dialectics because you see the color line also is based on a flawed logic. The flawed logic is the logic in Aristotelian syllogisms of dealing with universals versus the contrarian logic of those who are within and the universals of those who are outside. And in fact, whether it's apartheid or Jim Crow segregation, the project of colonialism and racism, they amount to creating two worlds. And the idea is that they should not meet. But of course, the problem there is that in the human world is always marked by an intimacy of communication through which there is always the dialectical feature of interaction and intimacy. This is why it is no accident that racism and colonialism were obsessed with the question of miscegenation. the idea is to maintain the contraries. A battle at all costs becomes one also against dialectics. Because dialectics always bring the contradictions in which there is not a completeness of one world versus the other. And we know this because the Euro-modern world is ultimately the creolization and interaction and meeting of multiple worlds through which, at the lived level, humanity is constantly pressing on while denying those interactions. Now, Jane Anna Gordon, Paget Henry actually talked about potentiated second sight, and but not consciousness. I think consciousness is the phenomenologically richer notion. And it was Jane Anna Gordon actually who made the shift in her 2005 dissertation in her interpretation of Paget Henry's discussion of potentiated second sight. But you see, this point about potentiality is crucial. And she moved it into double consciousness, potentiated double consciousness, which she fleshed out in her Creolizing Political Theory book. But the potentiated part is crucial here, precisely because if we deal with first stage double consciousness, that is where the so-called Negro is locked in the construction of identity as produced by the society that is antipathetic to the existence of that Negro. If that is accepted, then the Negro, as Naomi Chandler, whom Magali and Matthieu cite, and wonderful for giving Naomi his proper due, is that constructs the very notion of Negro and all the way through to being Black as problems. And as problems, the idea is linked to their elimination. But the dialectical movement appears when there's a realization that there's a problem in a society that constructs people as problems. And this movement then looks at the contradictions that enables the humanity of the people to appear as people who are not problems, but people who suffer from the problems imposed upon them from a problematic society. In short, the moment one can say the society is racist or anti-Black racist, it actually is a dialectical movement forward, which is the exact logic that society opposes. If we think of the attacks on critical race theory, not only in North America, but also in Europe, it is a narcissistic rage against dealing with the dialectical dimensions of reality. Now, in the book, there are some wonderful discussions of certain critics of Du Bois. Among them is Anthony Appiah, who, by the way, just did a recent turgid attack on Fanon. And this is a pattern with Appiah. He seems to be obsessed with rendering heterosexual Black men, particularly intellectuals, as problems, which is perhaps one of the reasons he's embraced so much by a fetishizing white academy. His argument, focusing on Du Bois's on the conservation of races, doesn't take into account the reality of the times, which included not only a rallying cry for genocide against Blacks, but also empirically demonstrated acts of genocide against Native Americans. The terms at the time Du Bois was presenting his on the conservation of the races at the end of the 19th century, the terms genocide and ethnocide did not exist then, though the problem did. And although he was struggling for the language through which to articulate it, the fact of the matter is, as we saw with Raphael Lemkin's formulation in response to what was done under the Ottoman Empire to Armenians by the Turks, was something that Lemkin began to see done to Jews, Romas, and various others, doing what for Jews is Shoah, and for others simply called the Holocaust. Now, the point of Lemkin's movement by formulating genocide is to set the conditions through which one can move into a crime against humanity. You see, the humanity part is crucial here, right? Even though it's not till 1998 in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in Article 7 that you see it in effect codified, the point holds that ultimately, if the aim is the destruction of a people, how can one actually argue against those people's elimination if one cannot identify the people, at least in the language in which they're targeted for that elimination? And so Du Bois was struggling simultaneously between the constructivity of race, but the fact that there's a social reality that could identify people for elimination. And Magali and Matthieu rightly point out how Stuart Hall, right, is attuned to the social significance of race, even though he too, right, didn't consider the wider context of genocide at stake in the 19th century. So I'll conclude here, because Jennifer did a wonderful job with the outlining of many of the arguments, and Magali and Matthieu introduced their positions beautifully, through pointing out that Du Bois's later writings make it plain that the United States, despite its self-serving formulations, is a country whose political ethos, because committed to capitalism and white supremacy, is ultimately not a champion of freedom, but instead an impediment to it. And this raises serious issues as imitation United States pop up across the globe. And it raises serious problems, particularly if we think about the emerging situation in a country such as China, as it tries to articulate its form of imperialism, wedded to capitalism, and racial logics of its own. Yet, and we see this clearly in Russia, yet, as a thinker and activist committed to freedom, Du Bois's work, existentially understood, calls for human possibility. His later autobiographical work, Soliloquy in My Life in the Last Decade of its First Century, reveals an understanding of this challenge to the dead and those to come. In other words, ultimately, in poetic language, if one is thinking about freedom, it reaches also to the anonymous, the unnamed, the people for whom one struggles to be able to articulate dignity and freedom in their own terms. This work then, by Magali and Matthieu, brings a spark of such reflection to scholars in France, scholars who unfortunately often lag behind the insights of the Francophone world. And that world is often listening to those messages across the global South. And right now, as our planet gets smaller and smaller, our little blue planet, as Carl Sagan would say, needs to break down the barriers of the contrarian logic and get into the dialectics of true, intimate communication. Thank you.